welcome back to part 2 of our delicious conversation with my special guest and dear friend, Annie Hopper. She is the founder of the neuroplasticity-based program called the Dynamic Neural Retraining System. That's DNRS. Annie teaches people around the world how to regulate their nervous system and rewire their limbic system. In part 1 of the show, we talked about Annie's story. This is a woman who has gone through immense changes herself, starting out as being the youngest stockbroker and then going on from that to become a massage therapist, and on from that to becoming a counselor and building a practice, a business in massage therapy, then another business in the counseling world, and then suddenly hit by this mysterious illness that seemed to come out of nowhere, an illness that she had no idea at the time had a global movement because everybody was not able to communicate with each other about it because it was quite mysterious. And he ended up homeless, living in a tent just to try and survive and isolate herself from all these things that seemed to be attacking her on the outside of the world, that she later discovered was actually something that was going on in the limbic system of her brain. And she's developed this system, the Dynamic Neural Retraining System, to help people to understand how their limbic system, the part of their brain, is working against them and how they can retrain it to come into place of relaxation and repair so they can heal. So Annie, let's dive into that part, because you and I know a lot about the limbic system, and I certainly would not assume that anybody else does. So let's talk about what the limbic system of the brain is first, so people have a sense of where we're kicking off from.
So the limbic system involves a complex number of structures. It's in the midbrain. It's really known as the feeling and reacting brain. It has to do with our survival, our stress response. It's involved in memories, our emotional set point or emotional reactions. It has to do with learning, and also it's filtering billions of bits of sensory and emotional information that are coming at us at any given time, and really categorizing that information into 2 distinct categories. So that's threat or no threat. You can imagine if the system isn't working appropriately, it can start to categorize information that is not threatening as threatening.
When you, being the listener, the viewer, you as an individual feel that panic, that threat, that's your limbic system working, and probably working very well, because you feel an anxiety as you cross the road and suddenly a car turns out of nowhere. That effect is going to go on inside of your body. That's your limbic system kicking in and making you really vigilantly aware of your circumstances. But if that dial is turned up, is what you're saying, Annie, right? If that dial gets turned up so that everything seems like a threat, now your limbic system is on overdrive. What's the impact of that? So let's just go to that. So everybody has a limbic system. Everybody's limbic system is supposed to show threat. Fine. But now the dial, instead of being neutral, is now cranked up to 8 or 9 or 10. What's the impact of that initially?
Wow. Initially, people might find it in their thoughts and their emotional patterns, right? They're feeling afraid, or they have a lot of anxiety or fear-related feelings, or feelings that are related to survival. And their thought patterns might be concerned with their survival, too. I think over and above that, cellularly, it affects us, too. So short-term stress is okay, but when you think of that long-term and the stress dial, it's dialed up really, really high. It starts to affect our immune system, which is our defense against disease, starts to affect our endocrine system, which is our hormones. It starts to affect our autonomic nervous system, which is those unconscious body processes like blinking, your heart rate, your blood pressure, all kinds of things. It also affects the way that our cells communicate with each other. It affects the way that we absorb nutrients or we detoxify. It affects everything, right down to a cellular level.
And certainly your limbic system is in your head, but it's connected to every other part of you. And as you're explaining there, Annie, very well, actually, thank you. This is going to have a cellular effect. So imagine for a moment, if you will, putting a substance in your body that is going to affect every single cell of your body, of your system. Cortisol, which is the stress hormone, is going to do that. You need cortisol. It's important. It helps your immune system in the right dose. It makes you be aware. In the right dose is what wakes you up in the morning so you can actually get your ass out of bed and go to work. But if your system is flooded with it, You're now just living in a stress situation. And so for me, this is very interesting because it's impacting the whole body. Now we're having all these different reactions and, quote, overreactions to things. I want to bring up something that I think is very important, Annie, and that's this. I have spoken a lot, certainly in the last 2 years, about how we are a society living in a version of trauma, some version of trauma. And what I mean by that is there was this little thing that happened called the pandemic. You might remember it vaguely. And all throughout the pandemic, people kept talking about when things go back to normal. And I kept saying, please stop saying that. It'll never go back to normal. And you're trying to create something in your brain that will never exist. And when we do that, when we're trying to return to normal, we're actually creating a stressor that is now looking for normal. And what do I see today? Not my opinion. This is well documented. We can all go out. We can all have dinner with friends. We can have drinks. We can hang out and go to the game. We can do all those things. We can go to our churches. And yet we're less social. We're actually avoiding those social connections that we actually need. We're avoiding them. Now, why are we avoiding them? We wanted to go back to normal because we're over capacity. We're over capacity at a stress level. There's too much going on. And even though we can do it, there is stress left from what went on in the pandemic. And now you've also got whatever stresses you've got going on in your own life. So you're already at capacity. So talk to us about that, because I know that you have been using this system in a way that you certainly probably never anticipated, which is that you're working with people who have long COVID. From your point of view, is long COVID a limbic response, or is it something else and a limbic response?
I think it's something else and a limbic response. So when you look at what causes limbic system impairment, it can be a combination of various things. So it could be from a viral infection. Absolutely. We know that COVID actually affects the limbic system. We know that there were lots of studies done that show that the limbic system has actually been changed from COVID, and specifically for people who have long COVID. There are all kinds of studies out there that show that. But I think the virus does a lot of things. It can affect your organs and all that stuff. And I'm not suggesting that the program would actually help heal organ damage. But what it does do is reset the nervous system. So yes, a virus can actually activate that threat response. And your brain, in its wonderful capacity to protect you, is doing that to protect you. But like PTSD, it's like a physical form of PTSD. The brain does not recognize when the threat is no longer present. So even if you're not showing any viral load anymore, even if the virus is completely gone, your brain can still be stuck in that trauma response. Same for chemical sensitivities. You may have had an original chemical injury, but the brain doesn't know the chemical injury that's no longer present. So it's as if you're always in the presence. And the brain is magnificent in forming associations. I just call it a brain pattern, a pattern recognition organ, right? We're smart, but our brains aren't so smart. So for a chemical injury, it could have been the chemicals that created the initial injury. But now, because of that injury and your brain's ramped up on the stress response, what happens is any amount of chemical can trigger that same injury response, that same response. So the brain gets confused just by association. So it's kind of like the brain never gets the all clear signal. It's like a home security alarm system gone rogue. At first, you don't really notice it. The alarm goes off, you check your door, there's nobody there. Then the alarm goes off again and you check the door. The cat has tripped the alarm. And then the third time the alarm goes off, you're like, what's going on? And then you realize like it's just a breeze that set off the alarm. So viruses can do that. Bacteria, like bacteria involved in chronic Lyme disease, chemicals, mold.
But your body is responding because of the limbic system with what you being whoever, may have associated as a PTSD response. There's a response to something that's a trigger for something that is before. So, i.e., there's a whiff of pine, and you may have been injured by that chemical pine smell that was in the closet next to your office. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. So even the smallest molecule that resembles that will now trigger like a 10 alarm response when really it's not threatening anymore, but your brain doesn't know that. I'd like to talk about the two truths because we know, yes, there are certain things that are injurious. There are certain things that do produce trauma, and that's true, but The second truth is that your brain is stuck in a stress response. So we need to balance those out with common sense, but also focus on rewiring the brain. Because if people are still stuck in a cycle of chronic illness, or they're stuck in this like stress response, like you said, they're still stuck in that stress response, then we want to address the stress response.
I really feel like oftentimes people think knowing is enough. Okay, I get it now. It's not me. It's my limbic system. I'm not a wacky doodle. There's something going on here. But that oftentimes is where people stop, Annie. I mean, they just go, oh, well, I know what it is now. And knowing what it is can become another excuse to just go, well, you have to put up with me, the fact that I have to live in a polythene bag here because I know what it is. It's a limbic problem. You say, and again, clearly in the book, knowing is not enough. Talk to us a bit more about that.
Well, it's kind of like learning any new skill. Like I can say, I love Spanish. I love Spanish. Learning how to speak Spanish is going to really allow me to go all over the world because so many people are Spanish speaking. But until I actually learn Spanish, it's not going to do anything, right? That's just a thought. So it's the same thing. Knowing that you have a limbic system impairment is not enough. You have to actually practice. It's not an intellectual exercise. It is an experiential exercise that you have to do and practice every day. What we recommend is an hour every day for a minimum of 6 months to actually get your brain to rewire, or that part of your brain to rewire. Now, some people will notice changes within days or even within weeks or whatever, but it's not enough just to see changes. You have to keep practicing and keep practicing and keep practicing until those new neural pathways are strong enough and that stress response is dialed down enough. We've seen not just people with sensitivity issues, but even food sensitivities. People gotten down to the fact that they develop mast cell activation syndrome, and then they become sensitive to all kinds of foods. And again, that's a stress response activating your immune system. So if we can get the stress response to regulate, then it'll stop activating the mast cells. And that will improve people's capacity to actually eat more food.
Well, I think there's an important piece here, and that is thinking about this as a master switch. The limbic system is dialed off. As a master switch, it is going to impact all the other systems. Now, I know you have 5 pillars for recovery inside of your DNRS program. Walk us through these 5 pillars, because I think it's going to help people to comprehend better how this actually works. The idea that there's 12 or 13 hours might seem like, oh my God, that's overwhelming. Well, is it? I mean, when you think about living the rest of your life in a bubble or having this set of symptoms, whatever it is that you've got, ongoingly and never having a specialist, how many hours do you spend running around from specialist to specialist trying to find something when you could actually do something? So those 12 hours are based on these 5 pillars for your recovery. Walk us through those, Annie, so we can grasp it.
Well, the first pillar of recovery is really understanding that your brain is involved in your condition. So we really go into the science behind what we're doing. What is the limbic system? How's your brain working? How is it affecting your immune system? How is it affecting your endocrine system? So we're really going into great detail about the limbic system, about the stress response and how that affects your entire body, how it affects your thoughts, how it affects your emotional responses or emotional reactions, how it affects your behaviors. So that's really about backbone of the science behind it. And then the second pillar is redirecting pathways of the past, or interrupting and redirecting pathways of the past, or POPs. So those are really thought behaviors, emotional behaviors, or physical behaviors that might inadvertently actually be strengthening the neural pathways that are at play. So they're actually strengthening the stress response. I'll give you an example from my own life. If I was chemically sensitive, I would always be thinking ahead of time, where am I going? Who's going to be there? Am I going to be safe? Is it going to be okay for me? Is there going to be enough room for me to breathe? Is there going to be fresh air? Whatever it would look like for that. Emotionally, anytime you're going to fear, anything related to fear or kind of feeling hopeless, feeling angry. Angry is a good one too, actually, feeling anger for no reason, without appropriate cause, I would say. So looking at your emotional patterns too. And your behavioral patterns. Are you avoiding things? Are you avoiding people? Are you avoiding places? Are you actually avoiding engaging with people for whatever reason? So really looking at your behaviors and then noticing, are those somehow related to limbic system impairment? And if they are, what would be a different pattern that you could overlap that with? Recognizing your POPs. Third pillar is actually doing the DNRS retraining steps, which is basically a guided visualization that really involves elevating your emotional state. It's basically an NLP, neuro-linguistic programming type of technique where you're really elevating your emotional state and bypassing the timeline of illness. So it helps you release all those really feel-good chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin and serotonin and endorphins. We really want to get people elevated. And the fourth pillar is incremental training. And that's where you purposely put yourself in front of whatever it is that you're trying to avoid. Now, that's done in a very mindful and educated way.
I imagine it takes confronting a great deal of terror for somebody who has been living in isolation. But you told me the stories in the book are phenomenal. But people who are living in a shed at the end of their garden in their own house because they can't go into their own home with their own family. So the idea of exposing myself to this thing when I can't even be with my family, that's got to be terrifying for some people.
Yeah, and it's not even just the sensory stuff, but also energy. So for people that have chronic fatigue, it's kind of like, well, hang on a second. Is it possible to do something just for a little bit? And as soon as you feel that stress response or those symptoms, or you want to go into changing your whole emotional pattern around that, because that will help change your brain structure and function. And I think I may be oversimplifying it a little bit, and I don't want people to think that I don't get it, what their illness is doing and how incapacitating this can be. I get it, but there is a way to incrementally train your brain around that to create a different response and reset the nervous system. And sometimes it might just start in your imagination. The imagination is real enough. We can start with the imagination and move up from there. So that's the fourth step, incremental training. And again, it's done in a mindful way and in a way that works for the person. And I also need to let people know it doesn't mean that you're not going to have symptoms. Like, you're still going to have symptoms, and that's not the point. It's not the point of making your symptoms go away. It's about retraining your brain. And when you retrain that stress response, the symptoms will go away naturally in their own time. Okay, so incremental training, the fifth pillar is elevating your emotional state, because it's incredibly important to keep our state elevated and to actually bring the limbic system back into some kind of balanced state. Because typically, when we're in limbic system impairment, we're focused on what's not going well in the world. Our innate negativity bias is amplified, so we need to balance that out.
As I said, there are probably very likely listeners listening to us who are recognizing some of those symptoms in themselves, or certainly recognizing those symptoms in somebody that they love and care about. But we, in many ways, are living in a world that is heightened with threat, whether it's a war in the Middle East or a war in Eastern Europe, economics, housing. There's so many stresses on all of us, and we live in the world of media. It's no longer about what's true. It's about who can do it first and with the most amount of bang, the most amount of drama. So it seems like, and forgive me here for being assumptive, but it seems like much of what you're teaching is valuable for most people. I don't just mean people having all those symptoms, like trying to cope with this freaking world as it is. So what I'm thinking of it is this, is let's imagine that as you're listening or watching this, you have a family member or friend or lover or whoever it might be who is showing some of these symptoms, but you're okay. Maybe it's a good idea for you to do it side by side. Maybe it's a good idea for you to go, I don't seem to have these severity of symptoms that you have, but I am certainly living in that same world and bombarded with these threats. Maybe this would help me to think clearer. Maybe this will actually make me have greater access to my prefrontal cortex so I can think clearer and be more available to myself, to my situation, to my family, to those that I love, to my business, to my leadership, whatever it might be. This might be a very good system for somebody in a leadership who are dealing with enormous amounts of stress on a daily basis. If you don't have all those symptoms, wouldn't this be valuable to somebody who's in a leadership position?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you already nailed it. It allows you access to your prefrontal cortex where you can make beautiful decisions, right? Because when you've got that chronic stress going on in the background, it muddles things. And it's not as easy to make good decisions moving forward. And a lot of people might just suffer from brain fog. They're like, I just can't think clearly. I just don't seem to be as alert as I once was. This is beneficial for anyone. And back to the media thing for a second, because we're bombarded with bad news. we're bombarded by stuff that makes us feel fearful. And I don't think we recognize, or I didn't recognize, certainly I can speak for myself to say how impactful that is on a daily basis. And what would it be like if we actually listened to good news? What would it be like if we actually cultivate joy and take some time to actually cultivate those emotions? And what would that bring about? In part of the visualization techniques that I teach people, I go to a good memory. I want you to go to a good memory, a really, really great one. Some time where you can feel connected to people or to something or to nature or to spirit or whatever. Feel connected somehow. It's amazing what happens, because at first they're like, I don't have any positive memories, because they've been stuck in crisis and in stress for so long that they just don't have access to it. So it's amazing because emotions can be the gateway into memory. We know that's true for trauma, but could it also be used in a different way? Could positive emotions be the gateway for lowering your stress response and access to positive emotions from your past? I've seen such miraculous kind of healings that it always floors me to think that accessing our positive emotions or elevating our emotional state can lead our brain into remembering so much more and provide clarity of mind, clarity of physical being.
Well, I know that the book is full of stories like this. And I know because we've been together and you've told me some of these stories and you've read me some of these stories and people who write to you. Is there a story that stands out for you? Because I know there are thousands, literally thousands.
I think the one that stands out the most, I'm going to try not to cry. It was written by a little boy, and his mom had taken the program, and her husband and son, Gavin's his name, came to pick her up after the program was over. And he had spent hours writing me a thank you card. It said, "Thank you for healing my mom. I'm number 9 and 14 on the baseball and football team, and I can't wait for my mom to be able to play with me and take me places." So that's probably one of the most touching ones, because it means not just people reclaiming their lives, but it's about their children and their families. And recovery has a ripple effect through their entire communities. So I have his letter framed in my office, and I look at it every day because I know it's not just about him. And he's now in university playing football, and he's a grown man. But I will always keep that letter because that's what hits me the most.
When you think about this, and it's really important for people to consider this limbic system and what it does. You know this, Annie, because we've talked about this many times. I am greatly of the belief that everybody you meet is in some kind of pain. And everybody you meet is trying to ease their pain in some way, shape, or form. And whatever that pain is, it's from their history, from sexual abuse as a child, or verbal, emotional abuse, or whatever it is. When I look at that and I think about that and the impact of that on the limbic system, on how we respond to those things. You talked about your dad when you were a kid. Your dad was an alcoholic. And I wonder if he was managing his limbic system for trauma that he was feeling, and he was just trying to calm that shit down by drinking, and then ended up drinking too much. I'm not in any way excusing anything, but when we look at all those things and we consider the fact that people are in pain and trying to feel better, and now we move that into the brain science, they're in pain about something that's caused an overreaction in their limbic system, and they're now trying to manage their limbic system, not just the stress of whatever it was. And so now we have a whole different way of looking at these people who are reacting in ways that seem crazy, seem way over the top or whatever it is. And now we can come to this from a place of, this is the limbic system. This person is simply in reaction to their own brain. They're not necessarily bad or evil or horrible human beings or horrible parents. They're trying to cope inside of a situation that is unfathomable for them and that they may feel like they can't get away from. And maybe that's why some people piss off from a family and they just leave. Because it's like they're actually trying to manage this part of their system. And I just wonder if we all sort of took a pause and went, what's my limbic system doing right now? What that part of me that is the fight, flight, freeze, the emergency part of me, how is that reacting in a way that is blowing this, whatever this is, out of context. Because, I don't know, I'm a human being. I have conversations with my wife where I know that I'm overreacting, and fortunately I'm cognitive enough to catch that and do something about it. But I can remember when I couldn't. I can remember those days 30 odd years ago when I couldn't do that. And I remember thinking, I wish I could control that sort of thing. But that is the limbic system, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Good point. If you look historically, if I think about my own father in that situation, I think, wow, I would have had an entirely different life. And I'm okay with what happened because everything that happened led me to this point, and it's okay. But if he would have had control over his own limbic system, I would have had a completely different life.
And so if you could sort of go back and meet that little girl who was in your family at that time, dealing with your mom and dad as they were, no changes, and you could see that little girl, I don't want you to give her advice. That's actually a terrible question. What would that little girl think about the woman you've become?
Good question. I think that the little girl would be amazed. She would be excited and happy and incredibly grateful for the ability that I have to help people. I think that she would be just so relieved that there is an answer, that life can be fun, that life can be joyful, and that the possibilities are endless.
When we're in something, whatever that something is, whether that's being a child of an alcoholic parent or being in a terrible marriage or being horribly sick, it's very easy for the brain to think this is it. This is how it will always be. And I think that's why I like to ask people to go back and ask what that part of you that might have felt stuck at that time would look at you and what would they think today. I think that that's a profound way to recalibrate that part of our lives and say, this is shit. It's horrible. And it leads to this place. And in your case, it doesn't just lead to this place, but it means transformation for so many other people. Our listeners are listening, and I want them to walk away with something that is impactful and practical. What is something that you would want our viewers, our listeners to hear, to see, that they could walk away and put into action in the next 5 minutes or 5 days that might actually help their limbic system, aside from, of course, going to your website and all the rest of that, which I encourage them to do?
I think to be mindful in the moment and squeeze the goodness out of life. If you're sitting there and you're enjoying a hot drink, take some time and just notice the goodness of that moment. Like maybe it's feeling the warmth of the cup on your hands. Maybe it's looking around the room and just being able to say, wow, I love that painting. It reminds me of my family. Or I love that picture of my grandchild. They just bring so much joy to my life. So taking a moment to just be in wherever you are and squeeze the juice out of it in a good way. What can you do in the moment to bring joy, to bring a sense of peace in this moment right now? So I think that would be it. Just be present to what am I seeing around me that is good? What am I hearing? What am I sensing? What do I feel connected to in this moment?
So much of what we do is focused on what's missing. And what you just suggested is beautiful because it's appreciating what is. I know that your beloved James has really been there for you throughout this. You knew James before all this started, and he was with you throughout the journey and is your business partner and has been by your side. You're obviously very blessed to have James in your life. I'm blessed to have him in my life. He's a wonderful man. I know how he stayed present with you. And I think that's the other side of this, is that if you're dealing with somebody who is going through some of this, how present can you be? I encourage people to go through that program of yours together. Certainly read the book together, at least. That will be a help to develop the compassion as well as the presence that you talked about, which is just beautiful. Annie, we're at the end of part 2 of the show. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Love, thank you so much for everything that you've shared. It has been deeply insightful. I want to make sure people know how to find out more about you, about the book, about your wonderful resources. So please go ahead, tell everybody where they can find out more about you.
Sure. Just go to our website. It's retrainingthebrain.com.
There they can find out about
the online video series that we have. The book's also available. The book's also available on Amazon. You'll find all of our support services as well. We have a 12-week living DNRS group support class for people that are going through the program. Unbelievable connections are made. Lifelong friendships are made. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing to watch somebody go from a wheelchair to be able to walking, right? How many people get to do that? But that's available. The Global Community Forum, which is an online forum with over 15,500 members from all over the world. Access to our one-on-one coaching.
Fabulous. Thank you. And before we finish, I just want to ask you, what's the biggest medical misconception about what it is that you do?
Yeah, I think that the biggest medical misconception would be that I'm suggesting that things are in your head, and they're not. It's actually affecting your brain, but it's affecting your entire body. So I think the medical misperception is that people think that because I'm saying it's in your brain or you're retraining the brain, that somehow that you've made it up, or that you can just imagine your way out of this, or that it's fictional somehow. And it's not. It's very real. There's a very real impairment in the brain. There's a very real injury happening that's affecting many systems of the body. So that would be the biggest misconception, is that people think that I'm saying it's in your head.
Fabulous. Thank you. Again, it's been a pleasure and honor. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are regular listeners, please remember that those who control the meaning for the tribe also control the movement of the tribe. Leaders committed to positively shaping the political and business landscape know that they've got to tap into what drives human behavior, and you can tap into that by understanding the emotional source code. I'm Dov Baron. I show businesses, teams, and leaders how to harness their emotional source code to move their tribe. Because unified, actualized meaning is the monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for individuals and for companies. Remember, we need your help in staying relevant, so please go to wherever you tune into the podcast from, rate, review, and of course, subscribe. It's always important. And a big thank you to you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about your limbic system. It is in your head, literally as a physical thing, but it's not something you're making up. It's a part of your brain that is changing everything in the way that you see it. And maybe by retraining that part of your brain, you can move into a recovery and a rest response that will make you have access to the prefrontal cortex, that part of your brain that makes better decisions, to allow you to be more loving, more kind, more compassionate, more caring to yourself and to those that you love, and to the business that you lead. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, in your life, and in your leadership impact. And I am out.